Hi everyone, welcome to the second video of Tpock's AP Microeconomics review series. In this video, I'll be going over the Unit 2 of AP Microeconomics syllabus, so all the concepts there using 30 multiple choice questions that I've developed myself. If you want to try out the MCQs before looking at these solutions, I recommend that you go to www.tpock.com and sign up for the free AP Microeconomics course. The link is provided in the description section as well. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel as I keep uploading a few more videos on the entire AP Microeconomics syllabus. Now, let's get started with Unit 2 review. What is the law of demand? Law of demand just shows us the relationship between the price of a good and how much of that good people wish to buy. In other words, it shows the relationship between the price and quantity demanded. As the price of a good goes up, let's say you start out here. As the price of a good, let's say it goes up from $10 per unit to, let's say, $12 per unit, we will expect that people will be willing to buy less of that good as the price has gone up. That relationship is captured by a downward sloping demand curve, and this relationship is also known as the law of demand. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, when we say that as price increases, quantity demanded goes down, so let's say quantity demanded decreased here, we are keeping every other factor constant. So it means an increase in price will lead to a decrease in quantity demanded, provided everything else is held constant. Another economics term you may come across that is a substitute for keeping everything else constant is called ceteris paribus. Okay, so if you look at the options here, the first answer, when the price of a good decreases, its quantity demanded increases. That best describes the law of demand. Note, in my explanation, I was talking about price going up and quantity demanded falling. The other way also works. Price falls, quantity demanded increases. And in both cases, we are just showing the relationship between the price of the good and the amount people wish to buy. Now, one thing that students often get confused with is option D. When the price of a good decreases, its demand increases. Many students pick this as an option. Why is this wrong? Demand in economics is used differently than you would use it in regular English. When we say that when price falls, people want to buy more, in economics we have to say fall in price leads to increase in quantity demanded, not demand itself, because demand is just a relationship between price and quantity. So it's that entire curve that we have drawn. It's not just one point. The entire curve showing the quantity demanded at different prices, that entire set is called demand. So when we say demand changes, we are saying this entire relationship is changing, and it is shown with a rightward shift or a leftward shift of the demand curve. So for our purposes in economics, whenever we see a change in price of the good, we will always see a change in quantity demanded of the good. So that is why D is not the right answer. One last thing, option C says, an increase in the price of a good leads to an increase in quantity supplied. That is a true statement, but this is law of supply, not law of demand. Hence, this would also be the incorrect answer in the context of this question. We know that the shape of a demand curve is downward sloping. It captures the law of demand, which says that when the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded will fall, all else constant. Now, this idea that people want to buy less when prices go up may seem very intuitive to us, but economists have actually pointed out 3 reasons why this happens. So we'll go through them one by one. The first one is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So the satisfaction you get from your first cup of coffee of the day is higher than the second cup, which is the satisfaction you get from the second cup is likely higher than that of the third cup, and so on. So remember that the price we are willing to pay for something is dependent on our marginal utility from it. The second cup of coffee is not as desirable as the first cup of coffee, so you're likely willing to pay less. So only when the price goes down would you be buying the second cup. So that is how law of diminishing marginal utility has a role to play in our law of demand. The second factor that explains law of demand is called the substitution effect. So as the price of coffee goes down, it becomes cheaper compared to its substitutes, perhaps tea, bubble tea, or some other beverage. So as the fall in price has made coffee more attractive compared to its substitutes, people will buy more of it. This is called the substitution effect. The last factor that explains law of demand is called income effect. And it relies on this idea that we have a set or fixed amount of money or budget available to us. When the price of a good falls, it opens up more money in our budget. With that extra amount, we can buy more of the coffee or maybe more of other goods. But this is happening because of our real income increasing. As in, when the price of a good falls, it allows our budget to go further. So with all three factors, the law of diminishing marginal utility, the substitution effect, and the income effect, all three of them explains the downward sloping shape of the demand curve. So if you look at the answer here, the income and substitution effects move the quantity demanded in the same direction. So that would be the answer for this question. One thing I want to point out here though, there's an issue of normal good versus inferior good. Normal goods are goods for which when income goes up, people buy more of it. So an example would be, let's say, tourism, like traveling, airplane tickets, hotels, education. Most things would be classified as normal good, in contrast to an inferior good, which is where you see a decrease in demand when income goes up. So that may happen perhaps for fast food. When income goes up, people move to higher quality restaurants and move on from fast food. So people buy less fast food as income goes up. So that might be an example. So what does this have to do with the income effect? So I said when price goes down, with the same amount of budget, you are able to buy more stuff. Your real income goes up. So for normal goods, with higher real income, you'll be buying more of it. That is why in this answer, the income effect and substitution effect move the quantity demanded in the same direction. If this question was changed and instead of a normal good, we said inferior good, then what would happen is a fall in price would increase our real income because with the same budget, we can buy more. But since our real income has gone up and it's an inferior good, we would buy less of it. On the other hand, at the same time, the fall in price would make the good more attractive compared to its substitutes. So as a result, the substitution effect and the income effect would pull quantity demanded in the opposite direction. This would have happened if instead of a normal good, we were given an inferior good. But for the purpose of this question, E would be the right answer. In the previous question, we introduced ourselves to the idea of substitution effect and income effect when discussing the shape of the demand curve. In this question, we'll be diving deeper into it and see what is happening. So, in the question, we are told that the fast food is an inferior good. If you recall, an inferior good is one where when the general income goes up, people buy less of it. So an example would be public transport. So when income levels go up, you would expect people to use less public transport because they have better alternatives such as private transportation through a car. So usually goods that are of lower quality tends to be inferior goods. In this example or question, we have fast food as an inferior good. You can think of perhaps eating out at a proper restaurant being the normal good, whereas fast food being the lower quality competitor is the inferior good. Okay, so the question is, when the price of fast food increases, what is the substitution effect and the income effect, and in which direction is quantity demanded of fast food being pulled as a result of those two effects? Okay, so let's start with the easy one. Remember that substitution effect is simply looking at what happens when the price of a good increases. How is that good? How attractive is that good now compared to its substitute good? So when the price of fast food goes up, it is less attractive compared to its substitutes, perhaps takeouts from a restaurant or eating out at a cheap restaurant. So when the price of fast food goes up, current consumers of fast food will move away because their substitute of fast food is now more lucrative compared to fast food itself. So this is the substitution effect. So according to the substitution effect, then the increase in the price of fast food makes it less attractive compared to its competitors. So we will see a decrease in consumption or quantity demanded as a result of the substitution effect. Okay. Well, what is the income effect? The income effect is the idea that when the price of a good changes, it affects the purchasing power of people with a fixed income. So when the price of fast food goes up, consider someone who buys fast food regularly and maybe they earn $1,000 a week. With the $1,000 a week, they were spending some of it on fast food. Now, when the price of fast food goes up with the same $1,000, his purchasing ability is going down. He won't be able to buy the stuff that he was able to buy before because the price of one of the goods that he buys has gone up. So we captured this in terms of real income. We say that his real income has fallen, not his nominal income. He's still getting $1,000 a month. What is changing is with the same money, he's being able to buy less. So what does this have to do with normal and inferior good? Well, price of fast food goes up. A regular consumer of fast food, their real income falls. Now, we know since fast food is an inferior good, with a fall in real income, people will be buying more of it. So therefore, we will see that the income effect will lead to an increase in the consumption / quantity demanded of fast food. So therefore, the answer to this question is D. While that is the answer, let's speak a little about what this means with regards to the demand curve. Now, if the income effect of an inferior good was strong enough, we would actually see price goes up and people buy more of it. So its demand curve would look like upward sloping. That doesn't really happen. Demand curve is pretty much downward sloping always. The reason is substitution effect is always much stronger than the income effect. And the reason behind that is usually in the set amount of budget, people buy many different goods. So the change in the price of one good doesn't change real income that much. But the substitution effect for that good tends to be much stronger because it's being compared to its competitors. So as a result, the substitution effect tends to always overwhelm the income effect. When do you shift a supply curve and when do you move along it? This is a question that troubles many students. So in this video, while solving this multiple choice question, I'll be going through that. The key idea here is that sellers may want to sell more of a good or less of a good due to various reasons. The big reason that may wish to change the amount they want to sell is the price of that good. So for instance, in this question, when there's a decrease in the price of tea, we would expect that sellers would want to sell less. How do we capture it through our graphs? Well, the supply curve already captures the relationship between the price of the good and the quantity sellers are willing to sell. So we know as price of tea falls, sellers want to sell less. Now, we captured that by a movement down the supply curve. In other words, we will say quantity supplied fell. Now, what about other factors? So perhaps the price of inputs have changed, or there's some drought happening, or the weather is poor for tea production, or some other factor that can affect the production of a good. As long as it is not the price of the good, we will have to show it by shifting the supply curve. So for instance, if there is an increase in the price of tea leaf processing machinery, it means production costs have gone up. It's harder or more expensive to produce tea. In that case, we would expect sellers intuitively would want to sell less. But we cannot capture it by going up and down the supply curve because that is just showing the relationship between price and the quantity supplied. So we have to figure out a different way of capturing it. And we do that by shifting the supply curve to the left. The seller story is the same in both cases. When price of tea falls, sellers want to sell less. When price of machinery goes up, production is costlier, they want to sell less. But how we are capturing it in our graph is different. Only when it's about the price of the good, we move up and down the supply curve. And when it is about some other factors that can affect sellers' decision to sell goods, we show it by shifting supply curve to the left when they want to sell less, or shifting supply curve to the right when they want to sell more. So in this situation, the answer is going to be B, because this is what we call a decrease in supply. Now, one thing students get confused with is, well, the supply curve seems to be going up. So is this increasing supply? No. If you look at it, for any given price, this was the quantity supplied before. Now they're willing to sell less. So this leftward shift in supply, although it may look like it's going up, it's not. It's actually showing a decrease in the quantity sellers are interested in selling. What about the rest of the options? If you look at the C, D, and E, you will see they're all consumer side story. So those conditions, C, D, and E, are showing how consumers are making decisions, and something is affecting how much tea they want to buy. So it has nothing to do with supply curve at all. Therefore, you can leave them out. Price elasticity of demand measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded when there is a change in price. It's officially defined as percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So the price will change first, and we will see some change in demand, and this relative magnitude is what we are trying to capture through PED. Now, one thing you are expected to know is that price elasticity of demand is not the same thing as the slope of the demand curve. Because slope of the demand curve would simply be the change in price divided by the change in quantity. That is not the same thing as saying percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. They're not the same thing. So that is one. The price elasticity of demand is not the slope of the demand curve, and therefore it is not the PD doesn't stay the same throughout the demand curve, and it is also not equal to the slope. All right. So what characteristic do we see for a downward sloping demand curve? So as long as it is a straight line demand curve, we will see that the price elasticity of demand starts out as elastic, or PD greater than 1, and then it eventually becomes inelastic, which is PD less than 1. So that means there must be a point where it has crossed PD is equal to 1. In other words, the unit elastic point. So as it turns out, if you draw a demand curve like this from one axis to the other, and you have a straight line demand curve, the exact midpoint is the point where it is unit elastic. So PD is equal to 1 there. Above that, you have the elastic portion, and below that, you have the inelastic portion. Why does this happen? There is a mathematical reason, and you can prove it, but you don't need to do that for the purpose of AP Microeconomics. So how to answer questions like this? So we know as you go down the demand curve, that means as price falls and you go along, quantity demanded increases, you're going down the demand curve, your elasticity of the demand curve goes from elastic to inelastic. So PD falls. On the other hand, if you increase price, quantity demanded falls, and you move up the demand curve going from inelastic to elastic. So that means PD increases. So if you look at the options, C would be the correct answer. If you look at the other ones, D is the opposite. It says PD increases as price falls. Well, as you know, as price falls, you moved down this curve and PD is actually falling. So therefore, it is not increasing. So you can leave D out. And for E, demand is inelastic at the midpoint of the curve. This is incorrect because at the midpoint of the curve, PD is equal to 1 or unit elastic. What does it mean when we talk about elastic price elasticity of demand? Now, if you think about how we use the term elastic in regular English, it refers to the fact that if you put some small pressure on something, it stretches quite a bit, very elastic, right? Using that understanding, let's bring that to price elasticity of demand. So in this case, when there's a small change in price, let's say 10% change in price was observed, and you saw a relatively bigger change in quantity demanded, maybe there's a 15% change in quantity demanded, then we will say that the price elasticity of demand is elastic. So in other words, it means that people are responding more to the price change than before. Okay. So what makes the demand for a good more price elastic? Now, there are 4 determinants you're expected to know: the number of close substitutes, the percentage of one's income spent on a good, the time frame of the demand curve, and the last one is whether the good is a necessity or a luxury good. Okay, I will not go through all of those, but let's go through the options here to see which one would be the right answer. Option A, production of the good is limited by a government quota. Now, this is connected to price elasticity of supply because the government quota limits how much can be produced. It's not a consumption issue. So therefore, this is not the right answer. B, a successful promotional campaign that makes the product perceived as unique to consumers. So when consumers feel that a good is more unique, perhaps they saw Nike ads and believe that Nike shoes are very different from their competitors, what they will first think about is, oh, that means there are less substitutes to Nike shoes. So even if Nike increases price, they will not cut back on spending on Nike shoes as much. So in that situation, this makes it more inelastic, as in people are responding less to price changes because they think there are less substitutes for that product. So therefore, this would not be the right answer. Consumers have to purchase the good whenever the need for it arises. So if, for example, think of medicine, you're sick and you need to buy the medicine right now. So in that kind of situation, when the even if price goes up a lot, you sort of have to buy it right at that point. You cannot wait for sales to be announced or whatnot. So you have to buy it right away. In those cases, again, the demand curve would be more inelastic because you simply cannot wait for prices to go down. You just have to buy it whenever the need arises. So this would also be incorrect. D, entry of several new competitors in the industry producing close substitutes. Now, when you see the first few words, you may think, oh, it's about supply side. Well, no. And that's sort of the trick of this question. It says several new competitors have entered the industry and they're producing close substitutes. That means from a consumer's perspective, this good now has a lot more substitutes than before, so they'll be more responsive to the change in the price of this good. So therefore, D is the right answer to this question. The last one, the wage of workers in the industry increases. This will simply be a leftward shift of the supply curve. It's a production related thing. It has nothing to do with price elasticity of demand or even price elasticity of supply. Price elasticity of demand has a connection with total revenue or total expenditure on a good. What is that connection? Let's figure that out while we solve this question. So here we see that the government has increased the toll of a bridge from $10 to $15. If the demand for crossing the bridge is price inelastic, we have to figure out what is happening to the number of vehicles and the toll revenue. Okay, so first of all, since it's a price inelastic demand curve, we tend to draw it as a steep demand curve. So we will draw it like this. Now, keep in mind that price elasticity of demand is not the same as slope. We have discussed that already, but this is sort of a shortcut to help us see what is happening in the inelastic part of the graph. So when you see this, that demand curve is mentioned to be inelastic, you can safely draw it as a fairly steep graph and make deductions from there. Okay, so we have drawn a steep graph and we see that price has gone up from $10 to $15. And since the steep graph, we can see that quantity demanded will fall, but not as much. All right. So what will happen to the number of vehicles crossing the bridge? Price went up, quantity must be falling, so it will fall from Q1 to Q2. So the number of vehicles will decrease. So the answer is between C and D. Now, what is happening to the toll revenue? So if you read the question, this toll is not just a tax or something. It's the government is selling a service, which is that of crossing the bridge, and they're charging the price. So in this case, the toll revenue is the same thing as total revenue earned by the farm. In this case, the farm is the state government that is offering that service of bridge crossing. Okay, so what is the relationship between total revenue and price elasticity of demand? Well, there are two ways of looking at this. One is you can look at it from a graph's perspective. So initially, the total revenue was the price of $10 multiplied by the quantity demanded. So this was the total revenue, the green area. So this is the old total revenue. And now after the price has gone up to 15, the quantity demanded has fallen, not as much though. So this is the new total revenue. So we see that as the price went up, government is making more money because they're getting more dollar per bridge crossing. But at the same time, so they have added, let me color it. So this part has been added, but on the other hand, fewer people are crossing the bridge. So this part is a minus. So as you can see, the positive side outweighs the negative side, the drop. So therefore on the net, total revenue has increased. So your answer is going to be C. Now there's another way of doing this without drawing the graph, and that is what I want to show you. So think of total revenue as price into quantity. So we know price has gone up from 10 to 15. Just by law of demand, we know quantity must also fall. Now when price goes up, total revenue tries to go up, but when quantity falls, total revenue falls. Okay, so there's a tug of war, as we can see. Now since the demand curve is inelastic, that means the price's effect will be bigger than the quantity effect. So price will win this tug of war and total revenue will increase. So using this equation, is a very simple way to figure out what is happening without the need to draw a graph. Price elasticity of supply measures the responsiveness of quantity supplied when price changes. So the idea is when price of a good goes up, you would expect sellers would want to sell more good. But there are many factors that affect how much good they can produce extra. So that is what price elasticity of supply measures. Just because price has gone up, we expect to see an increase in quantity supplied, but to what extent? So formally, it's defined as percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. Okay, so this is a calculation question and we are given some data. We are told that the rent went up from $1,000 per month to $1,200 per month, and we see an increase in quantity supplied from 24,000 units to 30,000 units. So how do you calculate price elasticity of supply? Well, if you use the formula, we know that price elasticity of supply is percentage change in quantity supplied by percentage change in price. So to find percentage change in anything, the generic formula is new minus old divided by old multiplied by 100%. So the percentage change in quantity supplied will be new quantity supplied minus old quantity supplied divided by old quantity supplied. And whatever you calculate, you have to multiply it by 100%. So I've written out the formula here, but let's put down the values. So here we have new quantity is 30,000 and the old one is 24,000. Again, old one is 24,000 multiplied by 100%. And you will find this leads to a 25% increase in quantity supplied. Let's do the same thing to find percentage change in price. Again, the formula is the same, new minus old by old multiplied by 100%. So the new price is 1,200, old price is 1,000 divided by old price of 1,000 into 100%, and you have 20%. So now that you have the percentage changes in quantity supplied and percentage change in price, you just need to plug it into the formula. So here, this is going to be 25% divided by 20%. So that is going to give you 1.25. There are no units. It's just going to be 1.25. Since it's greater than 1, but not infinity, we say that the price elasticity of supply is elastic and in this range. Some goods are related. You can have substitutes, such as tea and coffee, or you can have complementary goods, such as cars and fuel. So you need to use both to get the enjoyment of driving, whereas for tea and coffee, they satisfy similar needs. So what does this have to do with cross-price elasticity of demand? When the price of two related goods, one of the two related goods changes, we would expect that the demand for the other good to change in some manner. The degree to which that changes is what is captured by cross-price elasticity of demand. So consider in this question, we are talking about tea and coffee, they're substitutes. So when the price of tea goes up, you would expect some people to switch to coffee. And whereas if price of coffee goes up, you would expect some people to switch to tea. So you can calculate cross-price elasticity of demand in both directions, and they don't necessarily have to be equal. So when you're doing cross-price elasticity of demand, it's similar to PED in the sense that you're looking at percentage change in quantity demanded on top, and you're dividing it by percentage change in price at the bottom, but the goods that you're talking about will be different. So you're perhaps looking at price of coffee went up, so you're checking percentage change in the price of coffee and how it affects the change in demand for tea. Or you can do the other way. Price of tea went up, and then what's the effect on the change in quantity demanded of coffee? So in this question, it's telling us cross-price elasticity of demand between tea and coffee measures the percentage changes in the quantity demanded of tea. So that means it's talking about the first equation in response to percentage change in the, it would be price of coffee. So if you look at the options, the answer is C. Now, you could have a variation of this question where it says the cross-price elasticity of demand between tea and coffee measures the percentage change in the quantity demanded of coffee. But in that case, it would be in response to a percentage change in price of tea. So that is also a possibility. So cross-price elasticity of demand goes both ways. Keep that in mind when you tackle questions like this. For any good, we know there is a consumer side of a story captured by the demand curve and a seller's side of the story captured by the supply curve. Now, in a free market, we have to bring the demand and supply together, and we'll find there is one particular price where the quantity demanded in the market is the same as the quantity supplied. That price is called equilibrium price, and that quantity is called equilibrium quantity. In this question, we are being asked what will be the quantity of eggs traded, assuming the government is not intervening. That means we need to find the equilibrium price first, and we will read and we'll look at the corresponding quantity, which will be the equilibrium quantity. So how do you find an equilibrium price? You just need to look at the price where the quantity demanded overall in the market is the same as the quantity supplied in the market. So we have the supply curve, but let's figure out the demand curve. So we know that Beth at a price of $7 wishes to buy 50 units, whereas everyone else in the market wishes to buy 800 units. That tells us that at the price of 7, the market quantity demanded is 850. So all we are doing is adding up the individual demand curves to find the market demand curve. At price of 6, adding 62 to 848 gives you 910. And at price of 5, Beth wants to buy 85 units, whereas rest of the consumers wish to buy 945 units. So you have 1030. Now you can keep doing this, but we will see that at a price of 5, the quantity demanded in the market is the same as the quantity supplied in the market, which is 1030 units. So this is the equilibrium price, which is $5, and the equilibrium quantity is 1030 units. So in this case, if you go here, the answer is going to be E. The demand curve shows the different prices consumers are willing to pay for a good. And although different consumers are willing to pay different prices, they usually end up paying one price in the market. So usually that's the equilibrium price or the market price. So consider this. Perhaps you're willing to pay $80 for a pair of shoes, but the market price that is being charged by the seller is $50. So although you're willing to pay $80, you end up paying $50. So in some sense, you have benefited. The difference between the highest price you are willing to pay and the price you actually paid is called consumer surplus. So the person after you, maybe they were willing to pay $70. They also paid $50. So for in their case, the consumer surplus was $20. So in a market, there may be many buyers who are enjoying consumer surplus, and you can find total consumer surplus by adding up all their consumer surpluses. But this question is simpler. It simply says the difference between the price consumers are willing to pay and the price consumers actually pay for a unit of a good is called, the answer would be consumer surplus. So A is the answer to this question. If you recall, consumer surplus is the difference between the price consumers are willing to pay and the price they actually pay. Now, the demand curve shows the different prices consumers are willing to pay, whereas the price they actually pay, it's usually determined by the intersection of demand and supply, which is the equilibrium price. Now, in this question, we are told what is the effect on consumer surplus when the price of the good fell from P2 to P3. So what we have to do is find the total consumer surplus when the price was P2, then find the total consumer surplus when the price was P3, and look at how much consumer surplus increased by. That is the area that would be the answer to this question. So let's begin. So at the price of P2, we see that the quantity demanded was Q2 units. So that means when the price was P2, only Q2 units were sold. So how would you find the consumer surplus? Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between the price buyers are willing to pay and the price they actually paid. One common mistake students do, they think, oh, okay, the first buyer was willing to pay P1 and they ended up paying P2, so this is the consumer surplus. That is the consumer surplus for the first buyer only. If you think about it, there are Q2 units were being sold, so people were willing to pay different prices, but they all ended up paying P2 units. So this orange area shows the initial consumer surplus. Once again, consumer surplus is the difference between the price consumers are willing to pay and the price they actually pay for all units sold. Okay. When the price dropped to P3, we see that more people were willing to buy the good. So Q3 units were sold. What is the consumer surplus now? Well, the demand curve, as always, was showing the prices consumers are willing to pay. P3 is the price they actually paid, and total of Q3 units were sold. So this entire blue triangle shows the new consumer surplus of all buyers. One thing is, you cannot get consumer surplus if you don't buy a good. So keep that in mind. Okay. So how did consumer surplus change? Well, if you look at the diagram so far, this area, the cyan colored block, this is the increase in consumer surplus. So that is equal to the area A, B, P2, and P3. So if you look at the answers, C is the correct one. Producer surplus is the situation when sellers are willing to sell at a lower price, but they end up getting a higher price for it. So if you remember the supply curve, it tends to be upward sloping. It shows the different prices sellers are willing to accept, but they end up usually accepting the market price for it. So for instance, a seller may be willing to sell something for $2 a unit, but they get $5 from the market. In that case, the seller has a producer surplus of $3 from selling that one unit. This question is saying the difference between the price at which a seller is willing to sell a good and the price they actually receive is known as, and this is literally the definition of producer surplus. So D would be the answer to this question. Sometimes when the price of a good goes up, we will see that there is an effect on a related good. Now that relation may be through consumption or through production, but there are goods that tend to be related in some way or the other. So one example of that is this question, where we are told the bicycles and e-bikes are considered to be substitutes in consumption. That means from the point of view of consumers, they satisfy similar needs. Okay. The question asks, if there is an increase in demand for e-bikes, how will this affect the bicycle market? So first of all, if there's an increase in demand for e-bikes, we will see demand shifting to the right, and the price of e-bikes, equilibrium price of e-bikes and the equilibrium quantity of e-bikes, they're both going to increase. Now, what kind of effect would we expect to see on the bicycle market? Now, remember, they are substitutes in consumption. When the price of e-bikes go up, you would expect that bicycles, which satisfy similar needs, will become more favorable to buyers. So we would expect demand for bicycles to increase as well. So when the demand for bicycles increase, we'll see prices going up of bicycles, and bicycle prices and quantity in the market will also increase. So now that we have solved the situation, let's see which of the 5 options accurately captures our deduction. Option A, increasing the supply of e-bikes. Now that is incorrect because the increase in demand for e-bikes does not increase the supply of e-bikes. Now you may say, well, aren't more being supplied? Yes, but what has happened is quantity supplied increased because the increase in demand raised price and you moved along the supply curve. So quantity supplied went up. You didn't see an increase in supply of e-bikes. So that would be incorrect. Option B, increasing the demand for bicycles. That is true. The increase in demand for e-bikes leads to an increase in demand for bicycles, leading to a rise in the price of bicycles. So B is the correct answer. But let's go through the rest of them. Decreasing demand for bicycles, that's of course wrong. Increasing the price of bicycles, that is correct. And therefore the supply of bicycles. This is the same situation. The increase in demand for bicycles that we witnessed raises the price, and yes, you see more quantity supplied, but that's increasing quantity supplied, not increasing supply itself. So that is why this would also be incorrect. And lastly, decreasing the demand for bicycles, that's also incorrect. So leaving you with B as the correct answer. An inferior good is one where when people's income go up, they tend to buy less of it. So an example would be fast food versus a sit-in restaurant. So when your income goes up, you're likely going to cut back on fast food consumption and go to a restaurant and dine in there. So in that case, the fast food places would be considered an inferior good. So in this question, they're asking you, in a competitive market for non-branded sneakers, which is an inferior good, all of the following are true except. So this is a key part here. When it says all of them are true except one, that means out of these 5 options, 4 are actually correct. 1 is not correct, but that is the non-correct one which you need to find and mark. So let's go through them one by one and see which one would that be. So the first one says an increase in the price of branded sneakers, a substitute good, would shift demand to the right. So branded sneakers, such as a Nike sneaker versus non-branded ones. So if the price of Nikes go up, we would expect more people to shift to non-branded ones, increasing the demand for non-branded sneakers. So this seems to be a correct statement, but this is not the answer because we know out of these 5, 4 would be correct statement with 1 being incorrect. And that is the incorrect one we're looking to find. Option B says a decrease in the price of non-branded sneaker would shift supply to the left. So if the price of non-branded sneaker falls, what would we see? So remember, this is the non-branded sneaker market. This is the supply curve. If you see a fall in price, so this is the price, this is the quantity. If you see a fall in price, that means you'll be moving down the supply curve. So quantity supplied will fall. The supply curve itself is not going to shift. So this is an incorrect statement. And therefore, this is the answer to this question. But let's go through the rest of them. An increase in the number of farms that produce non-branded sneakers would shift supply to the right. That is correct. If you have an increased number of farms, you would expect that more non-branded sneakers would be on sale. They would be selling those. But since this is not tied to the price of the non-branded sneakers, we will capture it by increasing supply, which is a shift to the right. So this is also a correct statement. Okay. An increase in consumer income would shift demand to the left. Now, this has to do with the fact that non-branded sneakers are an inferior good. So when people's income go up, they would be preferring to buy Nike shoes or Puma shoes instead of non-branded ones. Lastly, an increase in labor cost in the non-branded sneaker producing industry would shift supply to the left. So as production costs go up, sellers would be willing to sell less non-branded sneakers. And since it is not connected to the price of non-branded sneakers itself, we will capture it by shifting the supply to the left, or a decrease in supply. So that means these 2 statements are also correct, leaving B as the only incorrect one and as the answer to this question. In this question, we are bringing in two things together. The shifting of the demand-supply curves and its effect on the market, and price elasticity of demand. So let's see how that works out. Here we are told that the war has destroyed a portion of global wheat. So if you draw a market for global wheat, we'll think, all right, since a portion of wheat production is being affected, that means it's a supply side story. So supply will be affected. And since it has decreased, we will say that supply of wheat has decreased. So we shift supply curve to the left and we find that the price has gone up and the quantity has fallen. Now, one interesting thing you should note here is when supply shifted to the left, we saw a movement along the demand curve. So you see that price has increased along the demand curve. So what does this mean when it comes to elasticity and revenue? Well, first of all, total revenue is price into quantity. Now, when we moved from point 1 to point 2, we know that price has increased and we have seen that. So price increased here and we see that the quantity has fallen. Okay. So when price increases, total revenue will want to go up. And when quantity falls, total revenue want to go down. So there's a tug of war, and whichever one wins depends on which of the price change or quantity change is bigger. So we don't know whether it's an elastic or inelastic curve, but we are told that we have seen an increase in revenue for farmers. That means total revenue has gone up. In other words, it has taken the direction of price. So that from that, you can conclude that the price effect must have been bigger and won the tug of war, and that led to total revenue to increase. Now, let's look at it again. From our understanding, price change is bigger than the change in quantity. So we know that this happens when the demand curve is inelastic. So we have a big change in price, but quantity doesn't change as much. So that tells you within this range between 1 and 2, within this range between 1 and 2, the demand curve must be price inelastic. So B would be the correct answer. In this question, we are told that in some questions, you will find that you have to draw two different markets. So one action or something happening in one market is going to have an effect on the other market. So if you read the question, it says, if the supply of gasoline decreases due to geopolitical reasons, what is going to happen to the demand for gasoline-powered cars? So there are two goods here. One is gasoline itself. So that's the first graph that we have. And the second one is gas-powered cars. So let's go through them sequentially. So if supply of gasoline decreases, that means we'll be shifting the supply curve to the left. And this will lead to an increase in price for gasoline, and the quantity of gasoline will fall. Okay. Now, what do you think would be the relationship between gasoline and gas-powered cars? So you need gasoline to run gas-powered cars, so you would expect these are complementary goods. You need to use them together to sort of drive anywhere, right? So as a result, if a price of a complementary good goes up, so if price of gas goes up, you'd be less likely to buy gas-powered cars because it's just more expensive to drive around in it. So we would expect people would be buying less gas-powered cars. It's a consumer side story, so demand will be affected. And since they'll be buying less of it, demand will decrease. Now you may say, why aren't we moving up and down the demand curve? Because the price of gas-powered cars themselves hasn't changed. It's the price of their complementary good. So that is why we cannot just go up and down the demand curve for gas-powered cars. We're trying to capture the fact that consumers buy less of it, not because gas-powered cars are more pricey, but because the complementary good, which is the gas itself, is now more expensive. So therefore, you would shift demand to the left for gas-powered cars. So if you look at the options, you'll say demand decreases because gasoline and gasoline-powered cars are complements. So they are not substitutes. You need to use both to drive around in one. So this is a type of question where you're asked what kind of demand and supply shift would certainly lead to a change in equilibrium price or quantity. So the way to sort of tackle these questions is that you draw a basic graph first with initial demand and supply, with P1 being the equilibrium price and Q1 being the equilibrium quantity. Now your goal in this market is to find the shifts in demand and supply that would certainly lead to a decrease in equilibrium quantity. So that means the new equilibrium must lie somewhere to the left of the previous equilibrium quantity. So how can that happen? So first off, if you see a decrease in demand simply with no change in supply, you will find that equilibrium quantity has fallen. So demand falling while supply stayed the same would be one option. A second option, before I do that, so a second option would be supply decreasing while demand stays the same. So you have two options here. Let me write that again. So demand falls, supply stays the same, or supply falls, demand stays the same. So in both of these situations, you are guaranteed to find the equilibrium quantity to be lower than before. So if you look at the options, D says demand decreases, supply decreases. In that case, actually both of them has fallen. So in that case, you would have supply shifting to the left and demand also shifting to the left. We don't know by how much, but we know in both cases, they are trying to pull equilibrium quantity down. So D would be the correct answer. Now, one thing I want to highlight here, in some cases, you can run into a situation where perhaps demand increased, but supply decreased, but they decreased a lot more, hence equilibrium quantity may have fallen. But in those kind of situations, you have to know that which shift is bigger. In this question, we have no idea about that, and the question says which type of shift would certainly lead to a decrease in equilibrium quantity. In those cases, it's clearer. You just need to look for shifts that undoubtedly would help you achieve the change in equilibrium that you are looking for. So in this case, demand falling and supply falling both try to drag down the equilibrium quantity. So it has to certainly lead to the decrease in equilibrium quantity. In the market for residential housing, we have seen that the equilibrium price and quantity has both increased. So that means if you take P1 and Q1 as the initial starting point, within the span of 1 year, the new equilibrium is somewhere here, right? So the equilibrium price and quantity has both increased. So it's above the price P1 and to the right of Q1. So it's only in that quadrant where the new equilibrium must be. So the easy way to figure out what may have caused it is saying, oh, well, if we just shift demand curve to the right, we will end up with a higher equilibrium price and higher equilibrium quantity. But the issue is that among the options that you have been given, we are seeing that demand and supply seems to have both changed. So it cannot just be one thing changing. So what must be the answer? So first of all, demand has to shift to the right, but if supply also shifts, it can shift to the right. But if it shifts way too much to the right, then you will find that equilibrium price will fall. So that won't work. Or if supply shifts to the left, but shifts way too much to the left. So this is actually not way too much. Let me actually move it a bit more. So if it shifts way too much, then equilibrium quantity will fall. So that means you have to make sure that even if supply is changing, the magnitude of that shift has to be smaller than the shift in demand. So demand has to increase, and that increase has to be bigger than any change in supply. So in that situation, you will find that the equilibrium quantity and price are both increasing. So if you look at it, demand for residential housing has increased more than any change in supply. So C would be the correct answer. A price floor is a floor for a price. So that means you cannot charge lower than that. Usually a government would come up with these price floors and force everyone in the market to adhere to it. So in this question, we are told an effective price floor in the competitive market for chicken eggs will most likely result in. So let's break down this question. What is an effective price floor? So consider that eggs are perhaps sold for $3 a dozen. The price floor is a price that government sets below which you cannot sell the good for. Now, you can place it at $3, above $3, or below $3, but the price floor will be effective in only one of those situations. So if the price floor is placed below the current equilibrium price, what it means is the government is saying you cannot sell eggs for below $2. But this is not effective for the market because everyone is selling that egg for $3 a dozen. So if the government comes and says you cannot sell below $2, everyone will shrug and continue on selling it at $3. So for a price floor to be effective, it must be placed above the equilibrium price. For instance, if it's placed at $4, then that means in the free market, the farms and the consumers would have been buying and selling at $3, but now they're not able to do so below $4. That is when it affects the market. So it may seem counterintuitive because the price floor is not below the equilibrium price, it's above. So don't think about below and above, just think in this manner. Price floor means you cannot charge less than that. That can only affect the market if it is placed above the equilibrium price. So an effective price floor has to be placed above the equilibrium price. So now that we have established that, let's see what the effect is. Now, at this higher price, the quantity supplied, you will find that from the supply curve, is higher. Maybe it is 250 dozens, whereas the quantity demanded, which you find by going up to the demand curve. See, this is the demand curve. So you go up to this price, up to the demand curve. This is the quantity demanded. What this means is at the price of 4, sellers are willing to sell more than buyers are willing to buy. Now, whenever at any given price in the market, you have a disequilibrium like this, that quantity demanded and quantity supplied are not the same, it's the smaller quantity that gets traded. So in this story, sellers are sitting with 250 dozens of eggs, but buyers only wish to buy 180 units at the price of $4 per dozen. So the smaller number, which is 180, that is what will get traded. Although sellers are now stuck with 70 units of surplus eggs. Okay, so you will have a surplus of chicken eggs, and E is the correct answer to this question. Now, one thing you may wonder, why are we stuck in the disequilibrium price? So usually what happens is when sellers have too much excess stock, they would try to reduce price to clear it out, but the price floor stops them from lowering the price further. Hence, price does not or cannot be used as an allocation system. So in this situation, you will see a surplus of the good, which is chicken eggs, for the purpose of this question. The equilibrium price for bread in this market is $4 and the equilibrium quantity is 150 units. So in this question, we are told that the government is imposing a price floor at $3 per loaf of bread. So the price floor is here. So what does a price floor mean? Let's think about that. It's a floor for a price. That means you cannot charge less than that. It's a floor, you get stuck there. So the government is saying you cannot sell bread below $3. Now, what would be the effect of this on the bread market? Now, see that the breads are currently being traded for $4 per unit. So if the government says you cannot sell below $3, do you think there will be any effect on the market at all? Because sellers will shrug and say, well, I'm selling it at 4. Sure, I cannot sell below 3, but I'm selling it at 4. It's above that. So the floor is not effective. It doesn't actually have any effect on the market at all. So in that situation, there will be neither a shortage nor a surplus in this bread market, with E being the answer. But let me break it down a bit more. So let us say the price currently in the market is $3 and there is a price floor. Now, at this price, you would see that the demand curve, if you go up to the demand curve here, you will find this is the demand curve. If you go up to the demand curve, the quantity demanded is 175 units. And at this price, the quantity supplied is 130 units. So that means people wish to buy 175 units, whereas sellers only wish to sell 130 units. So when there's a disequilibrium, price tends to change. So sellers have few units, buyers want to buy more. There's competition amongst buyers. Sellers see that, they raise price. So they will be raising price until quantity demanded and supplied becomes equal. Now the price floor doesn't stop the price from going up. It only stops the price from going down. So in this case, even if you started out at the price floor of $3, doesn't really matter. The price would go up and you will end up in the free market equilibrium. So that's another way of looking at why the price floor was not effective here. When a government removes an effective price floor, the market returns to its free market equilibrium. So let's draw a diagram to figure out what must be happening. So first of all, when a price floor is effective, it must be placed above the equilibrium price, because let's say the price floor was set at $6, and at this price we would see that quantity supplied was higher than quantity demanded. Usually when the sellers have a lot of excess stock, they would try to reduce price, but the price floor would have prevented them from doing so, ensuring that the apples were being traded at $6 a unit. All right. Now, if you start out with this situation, because remember the government has removed an effective price floor, so you start out with an effective price floor to begin with. So you initially have a surplus of goods. Now, when this price floor is taken away, what the sellers will now be able to do is reduce price to get rid of their excess stock, and this will continue until you reach the equilibrium price. All right, so let's see what happens. The question is telling us that among these 5 options, 4 are correct and 1 is incorrect, and that is the incorrect statement that we need to find. The first option says the supply of apples will decrease. Now, when we say that supply of apple decreases, we are just not saying that sellers are selling less. We are saying that sellers are selling less apples for a reason that is not connected to the price of apples. But here what is happening is, as the price floor is removed, sellers reduce price and you see a fall in quantity supplied. So supply itself doesn't decrease, the quantity supplied decreases. So this is an incorrect statement, and that tells us that this would actually be the answer to this question, because the question is saying among these 5 options, only 1 is incorrect. So that is what we needed to find. But let's go through the rest just to make sure we understand price floor in detail. The quantity demanded of apples will increase. Now, when the price falls, when you're going back to the equilibrium price, you will see that quantity demanded does increase because you're moving down the demand curve. So this is a correct statement. And likewise, if you look at option E, the quantity supplied of apples will decrease. That is also a correct statement, because as you see, a fall in price means you go down the supply curve and quantity supplied is falling. So these 2 are correct statements. Option C, there will no longer be a surplus of apples. That is correct, because when an effective price floor is removed, the market returns to the equilibrium price. So there is no surplus, there is no shortage. So therefore, this is a correct statement. There will no longer be a surplus of apples. The price paid by consumers for apples will decrease. That is also correct, because an effective price floor had to be placed above the equilibrium price. When that was taken away, price fell. So all 4 of the options here were correct. Only 1 statement was incorrect, and that is the first one, and that is what we had to find for this question. A price ceiling is a ceiling for a price. That means the government sets a price above which a good cannot be traded in the market. That is what a price ceiling is. Now, a price ceiling is only effective or binding in the market when it is placed below the equilibrium price. Why is that? Well, let's take a look. So in this question, the government has imposed a price ceiling at $4 per gallon. So this is our price ceiling. Now, without any government intervention in the free market, the oil or gasoline would have been traded at $5 per gallon. That's the free market rate. Now, when the government says you cannot charge over $4, let's see what happens. At $4, the quantity demanded, and you can find quantity demanded by taking that price $4 and going up to the demand curve to find quantity demanded. So quantity demanded is 28 billion gallons, whereas along that price of $4, if you go up to the supply curve, you will find quantity supplied to be 16 gallons. So that means people are willing to buy a lot more than sellers are willing to sell at the price of $4. So we call this situation a shortage. Now, when you have a shortage, what would happen is sellers would try to raise price to clear it out. So many buyers, you don't have that many to sell, the price should be going up. Now, the price ceiling stops the sellers from raising the price. So you're stuck there. So you just cannot go up to the equilibrium price. So that means the price in the market will currently be $4. Now, one thing is, whenever you have a disequilibrium in a market and the disequilibrium is not really, cannot be addressed by price moving because of an effective price ceiling or a price floor, the smaller of the quantity supplied and quantity demanded gets traded. So in this situation, at a price of $4, buyers want to buy 28 billion gallons, sellers want to sell 16 billion gallons. Only the lower quantity gets traded, because trading requires both sides to agree. Both sides agree to only trade the lower of the amounts. So therefore, 16 billion gallons is what is currently traded. So this will mean that there is a shortage in the market at a price of $4 equal to 28 minus 16. So that would be 12 billion gallons. So there's a shortage of 12 billion gallons in the market, and the answer for this question is going to be D. A rent control is a special form of price ceiling, but one that applies to a rental housing market. So it's controlling rent, that means it's keeping rents low. So therefore, it's a ceiling on the price of rental housing in the market. So let's start out with a free market situation. So let us say the rental housing market has an equilibrium rent of $1,000. Now, if the government sets a rent control above the equilibrium price, perhaps they're saying you cannot charge higher than $1,200 per month in rent. But does it really affect the market? Landlords are renting it out, a unit, for $1,000 a month. If government says you cannot charge more than $1,200, everyone will shrug and go on with doing their own business. So they will be renting at $1,000. Government says you cannot charge more than $1,200. Sure, but we are not charging that. We are charging lower than that. So in this situation, a price ceiling that is placed above the equilibrium price will have no effect on the market, meaning that C is the correct answer to this question. Saying that, one thing I want to highlight here, whenever you run into price floor and price ceiling questions in the AP Microeconomics exam, watch out and first figure out whether it is effective or binding or not. That is a very common trick that is often, set up in questions. So you should be wary of that. In this rental housing market, the government has imposed a price ceiling of $1,500. So you start out with the free market situation. Here we see that the free market equilibrium, that is where demand and supply intersects, is at $1,800 per month. Now, if the government sets a price ceiling of $1,500, so it is here, $1,500, this is the price ceiling. First thing we need to ask ourselves, is this binding? So price ceiling it's a ceiling for a price. You cannot charge higher than that. So if the price was $1,500, first of all, if we go up to the demand curve, so you take $1,500, go up to the demand curve, this is the quantity demanded. And if you go up to the supply curve, this is the quantity supplied. So as we can see, there is a shortage in the market. The quantity demanded is higher than quantity supplied at a price of $1,500. So there's a shortage of rental housing at that price. Now, whenever there's a shortage, you would expect that price would want to go up. Sellers would want to charge a higher price. But a price ceiling prevents price from going up. So if the price ceiling is $1,500, there's a shortage, price is trying to go to the equilibrium, but the ceiling will stop it from going up. Hence, you'll be stuck there. So you will end up having a shortage. Now, if you look at the options, none of them say there's a shortage of housing. There's a surplus of rental housing. That is incorrect for sure, because we know it's a shortage, not a surplus. But we don't have shortage among the remaining 4 options. So therefore, the answer must be something else. So C and D talks about how supply or demand for housing will change. But supply or demand of housing change can only occur when some factor other than the price is changing. So in this situation, the government was just interfering with the price mechanism, and therefore price is changing. So therefore, you will not see any change in demand and supply themselves. What about the other stuff? Let's see. The quantity demanded of rental housing will increase. So when the equilibrium price was here, that is where you began. When the price ceiling was placed, price certainly fell, right? Because that became binding. Now, when the price fell, the quantity demanded didn't increase, and that is because the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, so it's vertical. So it's a special case scenario. So quantity demanded of rental housing did not increase here. Now, generally, if you have a regular shaped demand supply curve, and then a price ceiling was placed below the equilibrium price, you would see price falling and quantity demanded increasing. The reason it's not happening here is because the demand curve is vertical or perfectly inelastic. Option B then has to be the right answer. It says the quantity supplied of rental housing will decrease. Now, when the price fell, we see that quantity supplied did fall, and therefore B is the correct answer. When a government places a tax on a good, we show this on the demand supply curve by shifting the supply curve to the left. Now, why do we do that? The reason is, let's draw a supply curve and let me show you something. If you draw a supply curve, this, let's say at the price of $2, the first seller is willing to sell 1 unit. Now, if the government says, oh, you have to pay me $5 in tax, what sellers will say, well, I was willing to offer the first unit at a price of 2. Now that the government wants a cut of $5, I'll have to add that to the price I want from consumers. So that is why for the first unit, the sellers will now demand $7 with 2 for themselves and 5 for the government. Let's look at the second unit. For the second unit, perhaps the sellers were willing to sell when the price was 3. But since they now have to pay $5 in tax to the government, they will now demand $5 more. So this is 8. So as you can see, when a government imposes a tax of certain amount called per unit tax, the supply curve shifts to the left with the vertical distance being equal to the amount of the tax. So if you look at this graph here, when the supply curve shifted to the left, the vertical distance is worth $2. So that is the tax. Okay. So you start out, so before the tax, the equilibrium was at $20 and the quantity sold was 600. The tax of $2 was placed. It shifted to the left. Okay. Now, the idea is to offer the same 600 units, sellers now want $22. But the problem is at $22, there is a disequilibrium in the market. So the sellers reduce price a bit until you reach the new equilibrium. So this is the price consumers are going to pay. But remember, although consumers are paying $21, this is not the take-home price of sellers. Sellers still need to pay the government the $2 in tax. So therefore, they will take home $19 home. So this is the price of sellers that sellers get, whereas the new equilibrium is showing the price consumers pay. So the answer is going to be E to this question. If you have seen the explanation of the previous multiple choice question, you know that when a government imposes per unit tax, the supply curve shifts to the left with the vertical distance between the 2 supply curves showing the amount of the tax. So in this case, if you look at the supply before tax, which is this line, this is supply before tax. This is the price. These are the prices that sellers would have wanted without any government intervention. Whereas the supply after tax shows the price sellers want, including the tax, with the vertical distance between them highlighting the amount of the tax. So in this case, the answer is $2, so which is D. But one thing I want to highlight here, because there is one common misconception. Students sometimes think, oh, well, the distance between the 2 curves is the amount of the tax, but they look at it in a slanted way. It's not a slanted way. So the idea would be the supply curve with the before tax is here, and the vertical distance is the amount of the tax, not the diagonal. So be careful of that. When a tax is imposed on a market, how does consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus change? To this multiple choice question, we will review that. Okay, so we start out with the market for soda without any tax. So we know this would be the equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Now, the consumer surplus is the difference between the price consumers are willing to pay and the price they actually pay for all units sold. So for consumer surplus, the demand curve shows the price consumers are willing to pay, whereas they're all paying the price of P1, and total of Q1 units are sold. So you keep adding all this consumer surplus, and this is your initial consumer surplus. What about producer surplus? Producer surplus is the difference between the price producers get, so they're getting P1, and the price they were willing to sell the good at. So the supply curve shows the price they were willing to sell the good at, so it's here, for all units sold. So for all of these units, there was some producer surplus, you add it all up, and you get producer surplus. And total surplus is simply the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. Okay, so this was the initial situation. After the tax is placed, we need to figure out how these are changing. Okay, so let's shift the supply curve to the left by an amount of the tax. So this is supply plus tax. Okay, and we know this is the new price that consumers, so this was P1 and Q1. So this is the new price, or P con, that P consumers. So this is the price that consumers are paying after the tax. Okay, so if consumers are paying the price of P2 and the demand curve shows the prices they're willing to pay, you keep adding these differences until you go up to the amount sold. In this case, since the new equilibrium is here and the amount sold is Q2, this is your new consumer surplus. Now, as you can see, and I will erase this, this is the amount of consumer surplus that has been lost. So therefore, we can certainly say that consumer surplus has decreased. So the answer is between C, D, and E. Okay, now let's figure out producer surplus because it's a bit tricky. Now, although consumers are paying a price of P2, remember that producers don't get to take all that price home. The reason is the government is going to take a cut, and the cut is equivalent to the vertical distance between the two supply curves. So in this case, so P2 is the price consumers are paying, but the tax amount is this vertical distance, and the old supply curve shows the price producers are actually going to take home. So P3 is the price producers get to take home. And remember, producer surplus is defined as the difference between the price producers get, which is P3, and the price they're willing to sell at, which is shown by the supply curve, for all units sold. So you go up to Q2. So once again, as you can see, this is the part of producer surplus compared to before that has been lost. So therefore, producer surplus has decreased as well. Okay. Now, lastly, let's think about what is happening to total surplus. Now, total surplus in a previous case only involved consumer and producer surplus, but in this new situation, we have to be a bit more careful because, well, while you have the consumer surplus and you have the producer surplus, now there is also a government surplus because government is generating some revenue, and you can think about it as the government is using that money to help the populace. Okay, so let me use a different color. So from the government, they're getting this amount of tax, the vertical distance, P2 minus P3, and they're getting it for all Q2 units. So this purplish area is the government surplus. Okay. Now, what about, if you compare it, you will see that there is a part that is missing, which is not being enjoyed anymore. this is the part that has been lost. We also call this deadweight loss, so I'll come to that. But the idea is, if you compare to the previous situation, you are missing out on this amount of total surplus. So total surplus has decreased. So your answer to this question is going to be D. Now, since we're on the topic of deadweight loss, because this red area is the deadweight loss, so let me explain what deadweight loss is. It's how far away you are from the highest total surplus you can get. So the highest total surplus you could have received was this entire area. Since you are missing out on this part now, that is the part that you are not enjoying anymore. You're away from the highest total surplus by an amount equal to that red triangle. So that is the deadweight loss here. Anyway, the question doesn't ask you about that. It simply highlights the fact what is happening to these three types of surpluses, and the answer is all of them decrease. So D is the answer to this question. What happens when a government increases the sales tax that it has imposed? So given the fact that it has increased the sales tax, it implies that there was already a sales tax to begin with. So we captured this by saying, all right, let's say if you draw the regular demand and supply, and P1 and Q1 is the free market situation, the government already had a sales tax, so that means it was perhaps somewhere here where we start our story. So we start out at P2 and Q2. Now, if the government increases the sales tax, that means the supply curve will shift further to the left. So this is supply plus tax 2, which is the higher, including the higher price, giving you a new equilibrium price that is higher and an equilibrium quantity that is lower than before. So in essence, after the sales tax was increased, you moved from this point to this point. All right. So based on that finding, we have to figure out among the 5 options which one of them actually happened. So the quantity demanded will decrease. Well, as we know, when it comes to quantity demanded or quantity supplied, we talk about them changing because of a change in price. Now, when the tax was imposed, the price increased along the demand curve. So quantity demanded did fall, and A is the correct answer to this question. But still, let's go through the rest. Quantity supplied will increase. Once again, quantity supplied changes when there is a change in the price. Now, when the price changed here, we moved along the demand curve, not the supply curve. So therefore, we will not be using the term quantity supply changing in any way. So that is why this would not be the correct answer. The price paid by consumers will decrease. That is not correct. Previously, they were paying P2. Now they're paying P3. So this is incorrect. Demand for tobacco will decrease. Demand isn't affected when a tax is imposed. Quantity demanded changes, as we saw, because price went up. So supply curve shifted, price went up along the demand curve, quantity demanded fell, but we don't say demand fell because that would imply the demand curve itself is shifting to the left. That is not what is happening. So you can leave out D. Supply of tobacco will increase. That's not correct. That only happens in a subsidy scenario, not a tax scenario. So therefore, you can leave out E as well, leaving A as the answer to this question. In this topic, we look at the effect of international trade on a demand-supply model, or how can we capture it. So we start out with the assumption that there is no trade. The country is simply using the domestic demand and domestic supply to come across its equilibrium price in the market. Okay, so let's say P1 and Q1 is the equilibrium price and quantity. Now, if this country opens up to the rest of the world for trading purposes, it can come across 2 different situations. The first is the price in the world market is above P1 or it is below P1. If the price of steel is cheaper in the world market, that means this country is going to import from abroad. Now, here's one other assumption we put here. So let us say that this country is small enough that it has no effect on the world market price. So that means, let's say the price of steel was $100 per unit and the price in the world market is $80 per unit, then it will be able to import at a price of 80 from the world market, and it can import as much as it wants without affecting the world market price. So in that case, we sort of show this, the world supply. So this is called supply world, and the sellers from abroad are willing to sell as many steel as local buyers want at that world market price. So this is price in the world market. Now, as a result, local sellers are also sort of forced to sell at the price. So in essence, when a country that was previously in an autarky, as in it wasn't trading, when it opens up to trade and the world price is lower, the price in the local market also falls to the level of the world price. So this is now the price in the local market as well. Now at this price, if you go up to the domestic supply, this is how much local sellers are willing to sell. Quantity supply domestic. But at that price, if you go up to the local demand, you'll find this is the domestic demand. So usually you would think, isn't there a shortage? It's not a shortage. What's happening is, by opening up to the rest of the world, the price in the local market has fallen. Local sellers will sell up to QS domestic, and the rest of the amount that local buyers want to buy at that price will be imported and be sold by foreign sellers. So therefore, so this is sort of the initial situation. Now, if a tariff is imposed, a tariff is a tax on imports only. So in this situation, if the government imposes a tax, let's say it imposes $5 tax, foreign sellers, they can always sell at PW to rest of the world, so they will not be able to take any of the burden of the tax. The entire tax amount will be passed on to domestic buyers. Now, this tariff is not something that local sellers have to pay. So for them, all they're seeing is foreign competition has reduced a bit because they're only willing to sell at PW plus tariff. So at PW plus tariff, local sellers will now be willing to sell more. Remember, they don't have to pay the tariff. And local buyers will also buy less than before, and the amount imported has now shrunk, right? This is the new amount imported. So if you look at the question, what will happen to the price and quantity of steel sold in the domestic market? First of all, the price, as we see, goes up, and the quantity sold, see, the local sellers are now selling QSD2, but QD, let's say QD2, well, QDD2 is the quantity that is being sold in total, with local sellers selling this much and this remaining amount being imported. So this is the total amount being sold. So compared to before, we notice that the quantity sold has decreased. QDD was being sold before, and after the tariff, the amount sold in the market has fallen. So therefore, the answer to this question is going to be B.